I think that it is starting. Sorry, everyone, always a little technical difficulties. Hi, welcome. If you are joining this class for the first time, my name is Nina Smilow. This is a class on storytelling. So what I mean by that is really telling a story as an oral format, as a part of sort of the heritage of telling stories with your words and your voice. And in the last few weeks, we've looked at many different ways of doing this, and sort of the best way to take what you want to say and turn it into a story, I think, is the best way to put it. So in the last few weeks, we've discussed narrative structure, which is to say giving our stories the beginning, middle, end that we talked about. And we talked about character last week, which I would argue today's lesson is really a continuation of that, but a little different. Today's lesson is called Setting the Scene. So a large number of stories are about places, right? Typically places that are new or interesting, or if they're very familiar, sort of how they became that way, what the history is. So a lot of the stories we tell end up operating around scenes and settings and homes and strange places. And today we're going to talk about how to create the scene of your story, because I think we have a tendency when we know we're going to describe a place to really fixate on the details of the place. And while that works very well in a written story, for a spoken story, it can actually sort of slow down the action, which we discussed last time. Is sort of turns it into a story that maybe goes on a little long, or one that doesn't really seem to have a point. When you're trying to hold someone's attention by speaking, describing every single leaf on a tree is probably not going to be as impactful as that would be if it were written. So we're going to look at two stories today from The Moth again that really work around their setting. That the setting, the location they take place in is the largest part of the story. Is really, one could argue, sort of the catalyst for the story. But we're going to pay attention, because I think the way that these places are created is not exactly how we expect, is not in sort of this detailed description of the settings, but rather something larger that really creates the sense as the listener of the place, which I think is the goal. So we're going to listen to the first one. Once again, this is not a video. This is a audio version of the story. So I'll share my screen and we'll listen to that, and you'll watch me listen to it. And then we're gonna sort of break it down a little bit. This piece is by Rudy Rush. It's called Harlem Cowboy. I'm gonna pull it up right now. And really pay attention to what gives you a sense of place in this story. And see if you can note sort of when you feel like you can see things clearly, and when you feel a little distant from them, and what the purpose of that might be. So here we go.
Three years ago, 4th of July weekend, I was performing at Caroline's Comedy Club. And I was opening up for Tracy Morgan from Saturday Night Live, and I had a great show. I mean, not, it happens all the time, but just this particular time. Everyone was, after the show, everybody came up to me and they was telling me how much of a good job I did. But there was these two ladies, straight Leave It to Cleaver, Leave It to Beaver mothers. They came up to me and tell you how much I watched that show. They came up to me and they were like, "Oh my God, you did such a great job, blah, blah, blah. This is our first time in New York. It's our first time here. It's our first stop. You did such a great job." And I was like, "Thank you very much." And they were like, "Well, you seem like you know what's going on in the city. Can you kind of like point us in the right direction as to what we can go do and hang out and see?" And I'm saying to myself, I'm looking at both of them and I'm like, whatever direction I point them in, they're going to be in the newspaper tomorrow morning. I said, I'm going to take these two ladies out and show them a nice time. Now, most of us are New Yorkers in here. I didn't take them to too many crazy places. I took them to a couple of places where they had music and paid probably 8 to 10 people, but they enjoyed it. They were from all the way in Portland, Oregon, and they were here for the first time. So reluctantly, I became the tour guide for the rest of the weekend. There's 2 other sisters flew in. Actually, the daughters were performing at the UN. So I'm walking down 42nd Street with these 6 white women. And all the black dudes looking at me like I'm about to rob them on the biggest pimp that ever lived. But they were really appreciative. We had a really great time. I showed them a nice time around the city. I was surprised I knew so much about the city. And just out of nowhere, one of the ladies said, oh, you know what? You have to come out. We do this rodeo every year in Pendleton, Oregon. You have to come. I said, okay, if you haven't noticed, I'm a brother from the hood. We don't do rodeos. But then I thought to myself, I said, okay, I'm a comedian. I've done a lot, in terms of seeing things. I went from Miami to Tampa, saw the orange groves, flew over the Grand Canyon, saw the mountains in Montana, just because I was a comedian, not because I saved my money and went. So I said, you know what, this would be another adventure that I can say, at least I tried it. They fly me out there. As soon as I get out there, I have a New York City cap, got a sweatshirt on and everything. They were like, you can't really wear that out here. So we're going to take you and get some clothes. Well, they take me to the store where, you got the Wrangler jeans and the shirts and the hats. They give me the store attendant, she gives me these Wrangler jeans. I mean, these things were Patrick Swayze tight, all right? So I come out of the dressing room, I'm like, are these okay? Everybody's like, no, those are perfect. And I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I'm like, it is true what they say about black guys, damn. So I got this whole get up on. I got this black Stetson. I mean, I'm looking like, Will Rogers dipped in chocolate, right? So we go out to this bar and we all having drinks. The ladies' husbands are there. We're having a great time. So this guy comes up to me. He has like 2 teeth in his mouth. He's like, come with me. I want to show you something. I said, where I'm from, we don't go with people that got 2 teeth in their mouth. So my buddy Tom, he's with me. He's like, no, I'll walk with you guys. So we walked 2 blocks. This is no lie. We walked 2 blocks to a small little pub just for him to show me a picture of a black dude who was there in 1915. I was like, you should have just called me and bought me a drink at the bar where he was at. Then I thought about it. I was like, okay, maybe this is his way of just trying to, show me that, I'm accepted and, he didn't know how to do it. And I'm just thinking in the back of my mind, like 100 years from now, they're going to show some other black kid my picture like. So the following day, my buddy Tom, he's a photographer, so he gets all access to the fields, to the rodeo grounds and everything like that. So I'm feeling kind of uncomfortable with Tom, but he's kind of protecting me. So I'm kind of like, all right, I'm cool. I'm a little comfortable. So he introduces me to the fence crew. Now, for you who don't know what the fence crew is, these are the guys who go out on the field and make sure the fences are up and make sure everything's right for the rodeo and blah, blah, blah. And one of the funnest things working with the fence crew, they actually snuck me on the field during the festivities. I mean, you got thousands of people in the crowd. And if you guys don't know, they have like this thing, the bronco bunking. That's when the horses come out and they throw the guys every which way. And it's very dangerous. Just my luck. This wild horse is coming at me with 2 guys trying to corral the horse to get into the pit. So I'm like, okay, I'll play basketball. I got some moves. So I actually dodged and I got out of the way. My hat fell off and I got up. Everybody was cheering. I'm like, I never heard this applause at a comedy show ever. Anyway, I've been going back for the last 3 years. And these are like my best friends now. I cut off my schedule in September. I'm like, I'm going to the rodeo, I'm like Batman. I put my little, hat and my boots and my pants in my bag. Yo, where you going? Nowhere, bro. On a rodeo. But the thing that is so special about this experience for me is that I actually happened to be out there during 9/11. And, you know, the 3 hour difference. I wake up at 7 in the morning to watch Sports Center, and these buildings are collapsing. I'm thinking, what movie is this? You know, until, you know, the reality strikes me that this is actually happening. And my mother works not too far from there, and my sister, and I can't get in touch with anybody. Uh, they're okay. But at the same time, these people stopped everything that they were doing. There was no rodeo until, you know, because I'm the only guy from New York out there, and they knew I was from New York. So the Cowboys are coming from the pits and everything like that, just to make sure that I got in contact with my family. And I thought that was very, very, very special, and which makes me want to go back for the next 50 years. But that's the type of people that they are. And even like the year after that, I came back again. They had a tribute to 9/11, which is funny because they flew in a firefighter from New York and this other guy from the police department. I'm like, hey, what's up, y'all? I'm Rudy. I'm from New York. They were like, what the are you doing here? It's like it's a long story, man. But they actually enjoyed themselves too, so it was cool. We got to, you know, hang out and stuff. But the thing that was so special this particular year, a friend of ours, Lucas, older gentleman, he has bad arthritis. He had like 2 fingers on one hand and like maybe 3 on the other. His wife passed away, and he's an older gentleman. So everybody kind of like, you know, grouped around him, made sure he was okay. That was the focus of our trip this year. And it was so funny during the opening festivities of the rodeo. They were singing the national anthem, and those of you who go to events, you know, you never, you know, sometimes you're walking around, you know, you never know where you're standing. And I actually happened to be at the top of the bleachers with Lucas, and they were singing the national anthem, and they had these F-150 fighter jets or something come through. I mean, so close you could see the nuts and the bolts in the plane. It was really a touching experience, and you know, he starts crying. And I'm quite sure he, you know, he was thinking of his wife, that he wished that she could see something as beautiful as that. And I'm thinking of my friends that I lost in the towers. So he puts, you know, his 2 fingers on my shoulder, and I put my hand on his shoulder. And I love those people, and those are my friends, and that's my story. That's it.
Thank you, guys. I know it's a little weird to do the listening thing on this forum, but I love that story. I particularly think it's great for us to look at, especially after last week, because I think this is a story that really builds its scene through its characters, right? But grounds us in firm details. So it isn't just a character description, it's really using character, which we worked with last week, to create a sense of the place and of the story, because ultimately, this is a story about Rudy Rush becoming an unlikely rodeo attendee, which he says he goes every year now. And so you could argue that that's the entire narrative, right? The beginning is this introduction to these women. The rising action is him getting ready to go to the rodeo. I would say sort of the peak of the story is when he's there for 9/11 and he experiences that closeness. And then the falling action is sort of him becoming a caregiver in that community. But the whole story doesn't exist in the details of the rodeo. And it doesn't even follow an exact narrative. It kind of jumps around a bit, right? So as a result, he covers everything. I mean, even sort of this huge global event within the span of a story that's really about a rodeo. So, you know, we start in New York at this comedy club, and it's interesting to me because he doesn't spend that much time explaining New York, right? Which I think is where a less adept storyteller might get stuck, is in needing to explain the difference between New York and Oregon and where we'll be later in the story. And I think one thing that Rudy Rush does well that we'll see in our second story for the day, and that I want you to keep in mind, is the use of shortcuts. New York, at least New York before March of 2020, was pretty universally understood to be the, you know, the bustling metropolis. And most people have some concept of it. So you don't really necessarily need to get into the detail of a place like that, especially if you know that your story is going to travel and that you're going to want to spend more time somewhere else. Even Portland, Oregon versus Pendleton, Oregon, right? He says Portland, Oregon kind of quickly, kind of a throwaway, but Pendleton, Oregon, he hits a little more because that is the place where the whole center of the story is going to be. And it's also a place most of us probably don't know. You might, and you might even be a frequent rodeo attendee, but I was not. And so it hit me. I was like, oh, that sounds like a place that is not necessarily so commonly visited. And then from there, we're in the rodeo story, but we're really told the story through his interactions with people, right? So this idea of his newfound friends fully integrating him into their world by taking him and getting him changed. And once again, we have some shorthand here, the idea of Patrick Swayze genes, like moments like that, where he basically tells us everything that we need to know about these genes and how tight they were without wasting too much time on it. And I think that this is important because often with young storytellers, it's hard to know where to spend the time. Because it does matter that he has to wear different clothing there. And it does matter that he does that and finds a joy in it. But we also don't need to spend that much time on the journey of getting the clothes or the clothes themselves. We can convey a lot if we think of a quick descriptor, something that will hit our audience. I think a similar thing is the idea of the guy with the 2 teeth in his mouth, and this idea of like, where I'm from, we don't go with people like that. Sort of immediately gives you a sense of this guy's appearance, and then he gets to subvert that. And they have this sort of strange but well-meaning interaction, which I think sets up a lot of the world he's in now, is sort of the well-meaningness of everybody. And same when we explore the fence crew and sort of these opportunities he's given. And it is really highlighted when he talks about being there during 9/11 and feeling that support and that community. And to me, it becomes pretty clear that that is the story, that he's setting up all of these different mini scenes with these characters so that we can really see that it's not just the rodeo. And I think that's why he doesn't spend too much time explaining, oh, it's like this, and the seats are stacked like that, and the horses come out here, because it's more important to give us a sense of the belonging that he feels at this place. Very unexpectedly, I think, for him. That is the story, is sort of him finding a place, strangely, of belonging and of caring. And then in the end of the story, when he is sharing that moment with his friend, sort of we really see the mutual admiration present at this space. And I think in that way, if I tell you I'm going to share with you a story about my experience at a rodeo, I think you would expect me to do a lot more explaining of the location to you and a lot less time spent on interaction. But I think for storytelling, often it is our interactions that make a place. And like I said, with written work, you have a little bit more leeway to spend time really describing the setting. And I think with a written story, you want to describe things insofar as they feed your overall narrative. And I think often that comes down to character and the relationships between people in those places. And they do not all have to be as sort of long-lasting and deeply meaningful as Rudy Rush's. And we will see that in our next story, which is by Sam Thurman. It's called The Japanese Mosh Pit. This one's a video, so we're going to listen to that and then, or going to watch that, and then we'll discuss it, and we'll sort of discuss both of these stories. Let me pull that up.
Thank you. So I am in Tokyo, Japan. I'm in the outskirts of Tokyo, Japan. I'm at the Fuji Rock Festival. It's a rock festival that is in the mountains. They convert skiing, snowboarding, mountain range. I'm there to see a band. They're called the Bad Brains. They are a Jamaican punk hardcore group from the early 80s. I'm timid. I would not normally have gone to a show like that, but in Japan, I noticed people are very polite. And so I am in the middle of a crowd of about 300 people. It's pitch black. And the band takes to the stage and the lights go on. And for the first time, I see the people packed in around me, and they do not look polite at all. They're foaming at the mouth, and their mouths are pierced, and their faces are covered in tattoos. And the band starts to play, and the crowd surges towards the front, and I'm carried like driftwood, and I'm deposited in the middle of the mosh pit. Now, I had apparently never been to a real mosh pit before, and it seemed as though this one was directed towards hurting me specifically. And I was getting punched in the face and like kicked in the ribs and jabbed in the shins. And so I tried to escape the only direction I could, forwards, further towards the stage, and I make it to that metal barricade between the people and the stage, and that is when I feel an arm wrap around my neck, and it pulls me backwards into the crowd, and then I feel a foot jab into my back above my buttocks, and then I feel a hand wrap around my face, and then I realize that a small man has begun to climb me. Climbing me like a human ladder so he can crowd surf. And he makes it to the top of my head. His feet are on my shoulders, and he kicks off. And as he kicks off, my glasses get kicked off of my face into the mosh pit in front of me. And if you've grown up with glasses, it is as if somebody has kicked your eyes out of your skull onto the ground for you. And so, without thinking, I dive down into the mosh pit, knowing well that I could die. But as I'm searching around on the ground for my glasses, something strange happens. I don't get stomped on the neck. And as I'm looking in front of me, I notice a light shine on to my hand, and then another light. And before I know it, the entire ground around me is illuminated. And I look up, and a circle of mosh pit guys have formed a perimeter around me. And they're holding their cell phone lights down to illuminate the ground under my feet. They look like angels. And I find the crippled corpse of my glasses, and I scoop it up from the earth, and I hold it close to my chest, and a guy offers his hand. He has a lip piercing. I take it. He stands me up, and he says, "Are you okay?" And I say, "Yeah, I'm okay." And instantaneously, the mosh pit reassembles. These men disappear into the night, but it's completely different now. I'm punching people in the head. And before I know it, another man wraps his arm around my neck, and he plants his foot above my ass. But then I look back, I grab his shoulder, I grab his shirt, and I fucking throw that guy as hard as I can. And I watch him shoot up and over the crowd, and he sails away back into the crowd behind me, and I can see the smile on his face. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys. So, unlike our previous story, we're really just in one place, right? Whereas Mr. Rush's story sort of traveled from New York to Oregon. We're just in the outskirts of Tokyo, Japan at the Fuji Rock Festival in this story. That's where we literally are. But once again, we're really told this story through the people that Mr. Thurman interacts with. And there's a lot of quick shorthand, right, for describing them: face tattoos, the piercings. So we have a real sense of sort of the intimidation level he has with this crowd. And he gives us background, right? We talked about in our narrative structure class this idea of we need some information so that the rest of the story makes sense. And very quickly, he establishes for us that he's a timid person, that this is not something he would do, that he thought it would be one way. And that it does not look how he expected at all, is not how he expected it to be at all. So in this story, right, again, it is tempting to think that the description of a story of this Japanese heavy metal concert would involve a lot of detail of the place he is in. Rather, Mr. Thurman chooses to focus on the people he's surrounded with. And I think it is because they make the story. So he has to set them up as being incredibly intimidating and as him being very afraid, so that at the climax of the story, when he loses his glasses, we are expecting one thing, right? And the reversal, for the purposes of this story, is how the crowd surprises him and helps him in his search. And that act turns him into a confident member of this mosh pit, a member of the collective, because he feels like he understands the rules now. And that there is an inherent generosity to it. As I described that, if you're thinking to yourself, wow, there are a lot of actual similarities between Rudy Rush's story and Sam Thurman's story, even though theoretically they're two completely different people taking place in two completely different settings, totally different stories, you're right. And I would say they're both examples of fish out of water stories. But more than that, they're examples of stories that use their characters and narrative structure, two things that we have really focused on, to build their scenes, because they are scene-specific stories, site-specific, event-specific stories. But they achieve awareness of those things through narrative structure and characters. And when I say that they're fish out of water stories, I think that means they have to do it more, because to create a fish out of water story, you need to give your listener a sense of what kind of fish you are, what kind of water you usually live in, and why this water or air or wherever you are now is so different. And a lot of that is achieved in these stories quickly. And I think that that is a point that I want to make, is we've been focusing so much on this sort of delicate balancing act. And I think once you start looking at your scene setting, you realize that you have to do all of these things pretty fast. I think good examples of this are when Rudy Rush says, you know, I'm from Harlem, I don't go to rodeos. And when Sam Thurman says, I'm a timid guy, but I figured people in Japan were pretty polite. Sort of right away giving us this sense of who they are, so that it can be surprised and counteracted, and so that they can interact with their environment. And I think it is tempting when we're telling a story about a place to focus entirely on the place, and let go of ourselves in that story. But by understanding ourselves and our alignment to the place, right? Whether that is that we are very comfortable there or totally at a loss, will instantly give the listener a sense of the story they're walking into. Both of these are really about also being surprised by people. And I think that's a key element of the fish out of water story, is that you have to be surprised. And I think because when we're telling these stories, we have typically been writing them for a long time and doing all of the work that we've been doing in this format, and sort of looking at our stories, picking three, looking at their narrative structure, looking at their characters, looking now at their scene. That element of surprise is hard to remember how to keep. And I think it lies in really looking at the people we're interacting with and thinking about those interactions. If you're going to tell a story about going to a mountain on, the top of a mountain all by yourself for months, you're still interacting, right? You're interacting with yourself. So there's never a story you're telling, probably, that there isn't a character to deal with interacting, even if it's just you. I would argue that for these scene-specific stories, that is sort of what elevates them. We've talked a lot about anecdote versus story, and I think what elevates an anecdote about a place into a story are those interactions and are the changes that occur. Neither of these stories really paint a picture of the actual locations, yet I feel that I have a really good sense of them. And I think that's because we're very quickly put there and then they stay there, right? In both stories, there's sort of a quick setup to getting us to the location, and then the rest of the stories take place in this location. Even though Rudy Rush sort of bounces around and talks about leaving and coming back, most of his story takes place at the rodeo over different periods of times. All of Sam Thurman's stories takes place at this place. And I think Mr. Thurman's story is interesting because unlike Rudy Rush, he doesn't explain exactly how he got there. He just puts us there. So I think for some stories, it's incredibly relevant and it's important background information, like for Rudy Rush's story, to explain why he is there. And to do that, he has to start the story in New York at the comedy club so that he can take us to the location of the story. Sam Thurman's story, it doesn't need that as much. What he needs us to know more is why his presence at this concert is inherently surprising and already a little bit high stakes. Which leads me to want to sort of talk about what we're going to discuss next week, but I do want to sort of conclude this unit on scene setting by basically saying that when we discuss the idea of a story that takes place around a specific place or scene, we are most likely to think that the way in is describing those places in detail. But I think that we help ourselves as storytellers if we think beyond what's obvious and we look at the people that shape a place, as well as ourselves when we're in a situation or a scene. You know, who are you at a rodeo or a mosh pit versus who you are in the rest of your life? Who are you quarantined at home versus who you are out in the world? When I say versus, I mean that space between the fish out of water, fish in water. There's a story waiting right there, right between those two spaces. And I think you are the best person to tell it because it's your story. In everything we do, all this discussion of narrative structure, all this discussion of character, and now scene setting is really about finding the most impactful way for you to share your story. Because if you're choosing to tell a story, not just in writing, but with your voice, I think often it is important to remember why you want to tell it. And I think if you're trying to tell a story about a place, you will find if you focus on the people or on yourself in that place, you will get to the heart of that story faster than if you spend 5 minutes explaining the building to me. Give shorthand the way that these two storytellers do. And I recommend if your story is revolving around place, you give these another listen, just to see those moments where they describe something. He describes the metal bars at the concert, and you can really viscerally understand that setup so that you can move on to the rest of the narrative. So that you don't have to spend too much time detailing for me what the concert looks like. And I think then look at your stories. I know we all have 3. And maybe not all of them are so much about a place, but I would bet that they probably feature locations. And I think in general, we can get kind of stuck when we have locations in pieces because we want to explain them. So really look at your pieces, which I know you've already established narrative structure for and characters for. And now I really want you to look at the scenes that they're in, the settings. And I really want you to think about, what do I need to tell people about the settings of these stories? What can I achieve in my character work that will do something about the place, about the setting? And what can I do in my background information, my lead in to the narrative that will give them some concept of who I am and where I come from and where I fit in this place. And look for shorthand. Look for places where you can sort of indicate something quickly. Yeah, I would guess if you have 3 ideas for a story, one of them is going to revolve around place. And of course that there are stories where you do have to describe the place more. And maybe we'll look at something that does that a little more so next week. But I really want to urge you to look at everything we're doing as something that builds on each other. So the character work you did last week will allow you to build a scene. Our last unit, which will be on May 28th, not next week, the following week, we're going to look at stakes of a story. And I sort of touched on this in the very first workshop, this idea of when we discussed bad haircut, this idea of this is inherently not a terribly high stakes story, but somehow it really comes across that way, right? So next time we meet, we're going to look at how you can use everything that we've discussed in the last few weeks, the narrative structure, the character, and the scene to really create the stakes of a story. Create something that means as much to the listener as it does to you, the storyteller. And it's not a trick to create that. It's really the gift of storytelling, is to make something impactful and important to someone else. I hope that in looking at all of these different stories, you're seeing that there's no one thing that is more important to tell than the other. There's no one conclusion that is the be all end all. There are just these series of stories. And what these storytellers do very well is share the impact that the stories had on them, on us, the listeners. And that's what I mean by stakes. Is not the most exciting version of your story. It's not sort of that I'm only interested in hearing the biggest thing that happened. I'm interested in hearing everything that happened. We're just going to figure out how best to make sure that the impact of the story on you is the impact of the story on your listener. And a lot of that is dealing with what we have discussed. So look at your 3 stories. Now that you have found your narrative structure for them, your characters for them, really look at their scenes. Really look where they're set. And really look at how the first 2 can help you tell me about their setting. And next week, or not next week, the following week, we'll talk about stakes. I'm really looking forward to it. Bye, everybody.